Thanks very mumuch. So I'm going to move to talking about primarily parental and child relationships within the home, talking about how housework inequalities perpetuate across the generations. So by way of sort of background, why this question might be interesting, we've seen a gradual change in egalitarian attitudes across the population. From more traditional attitudes to less traditional attitudes, to attitudes that promote women being in the labour market and men sharing housework, for example. But there's some evidence the move towards more egalitarian attitudes may have stalled or slowed down. We also see that despite the high rates at which women are now in the labour market and mothers are in the labour market, there are still major labour market inequalities between men and women. It's evidenced by, for example, the shares in part-time work and the gender pay gap. And we also see persistent inequalities in the domestic division of labour. And Catherine at the beginning mentioned how COVID is really highlighting some of the inequalities across the population. And we've seen the work on how it's enhanced inequalities in the domestic division of labour. So this is a really kind of live subject. So given these sort of slowing or stalling of moves towards more equality between men and women, both in work and at home, and in the persistence of some of these more traditional attitudes, what might explain that? Well, one obvious candidate is intergenerational transmission, that if parents encourage their children to think in a particular way, in a more traditional way, that will enable persistence of inequalities from one generation to the next, and so it will slow down societal change. So these are these complex issues. We often think of what happens in the private space that isn't really subject to policy. But I think you can think about the implications it does have for policy quite broadly, and we can maybe talk about this in the Q&A as well, that there are implications for family policies. So there's work that suggests that family policies can not only alter behaviours to the extent that things like daddy months encourage fathers to spend more time looking after their children, but also changes their orientations and their attitudes. And this can work actually in both ways. So in some cases, there's been evidence that more generous parental leave, and particular parental leave that's taken up by mothers, maternity leave, can actually lead to those mothers, those women adopting more traditional rather than less traditional attitudes. You can also think about implications for education and educational policies. What is the role of the education system in trying to shift or shape some of this transmission to think about how children might understand different possibilities than more traditional outcomes. And obviously the implications are also there for policies relating to long-term labour market inequalities. How we value paid and unpaid work, and how we think about and understand the pay gap. So to talk more specifically about what we did in our study, this is what I'm going to talk about is based on a paper I conducted with Javier Polavieja, and you can see the reference at the bottom of the slide. It's called Saying and Doing Gender, and in this study we wanted to understand whether parents transmit gendered attitudes and behaviours through what they say or what they think, and through what they do, both inside and outside the home. So how can we see parents saying and doing gender, it's in the title of the paper, actually shaping children's attitudes and then subsequent behaviours? And we wanted to look very much at whether this was different for fathers and mothers' attitudes and behaviours, and whether this was different for sons and for daughters, and whether we could find any indications that transmission of attitudes to the children adopt is consequential subsequently in the children's adults' lives. So by way of background, clearly intergenerational transmission is a key candidate for the reproduction of norms in society. So this is recognised. This might be the way that we can understand societal shifts or failures for societies to move, sort of the stalling of egalitarianism. There's an increasing body of research in economics that addresses some of these questions and thinks about socialization, but they tend to assume that there's active transmission. That is, that it's what the parents say to their children, what they actively impart through communication that matters. But of course, developmental psychology has drawn attention to how so much social learning is imitative, that it's what children see what their parents do, and they learn from that, they copy that. And that may not necessarily be the same as what they're hearing their parents say. And there's plenty of evidence that attitudes and behaviours are not necessarily congruent, that people will espouse one attitude, but their behaviours may not actually quite match onto those attitudes. And I'm sure if you think about this, you can find many examples from your own experience, from people you know, and so on, where you can see this sort of kind of mismatch. What we know is also limited by the fact that an awful lot of the research that we do have focuses on transmission of behaviours and attitudes from mothers to daughters. So there's a body of research which looks at what mothers said or thought, and what happens in terms of their daughters' outcomes in the labour market, whether they participate in employment, for example. But clearly this is missing out a rather large part of the story. Fathers are likely to matter too, and it's very hard to think of something like the division of housework between parents without thinking that that's responsibility of both fathers and mothers. And there's also some indications that fathers may be particularly important for sons, given that some of the literature suggests that it is sort of the same-sex dyad where the imitation, where the influence is most likely to occur, where it's most important. And so there's a need, we felt there was a need to address the role of fathers and the influence on sons of both parents more directly. And finally, there's little existing evidence that links childhood socialization directly to adult behaviours. So there's work that looks at the time that children spend with their parents when they're children, and what the relationships are between parents and children. And there's work which looks at parents and their adult children, and whether there's links between what the parents think and their adult children's outcomes, but very little which makes that link from what's happening in childhood to then what happens in adulthood. So we felt that it was important to explore that link directly. So the data we used, well, we used Understanding Society, but more specifically, we used the British Household Panel Survey, the predecessor Understanding Society that's linked through, because we wanted to get a long run of data. We wanted to enable our sample to include some children who would not only be measured when they were living with their parents as teenagers, but also when they were grown up. So we pulled together information on those who responded between the ages of 11 and 15 to the youth questionnaire of both the BHPS and Understanding Society. And this enabled us to look at around 1,400 daughters and around 1,500 sons who responded to the youth questionnaire across the waves, and who provided us with information specifically on the response to this question, which is a very well-used question that sort of summarises attitudes towards the division of labour. So the statement is: a husband's job is to earn money, a wife's job is to look after the home, and respondents are asked how far they agree or disagree with this statement. So that gave us our sort of outcome measure, how traditional or non-traditional are sons and daughters' attitudes when they are between these ages of 11, 15 and 15. And what are the influences of parents on these? So we looked at how far parents' responses to the same question that they were also asked, and that they were asked while those children were living with them, whether their responses were also more or less traditional. And that gave us our kind of saying measure, the influence of saying. And we also looked at the doing in terms of how much time the mother spent as a housewife during the children's childhood, the level of inequality in housework between the two parents, and whether the mother was or was not in full-time work at the time the children were surveyed. So these measures seem to emphasize the mother, but of course, as I said, you can't think of the mothers and the fathers' behaviours as being independent, and certainly the housework inequality measure is as much a measure about how much the father does as about how much the mother does the housework. So we wanted to look at how far these attitudes and behaviours influenced or were associated with sons and daughters' own attitudes between these ages. And we measured the parental attitudes that they held prior to the time at which we measured the children's attitudes, so that at least there was a kind of gap between parents and children. So we tried to minimize the extent to which children might be influencing parents, which is another thing that's beginning to be discussed, that transmission doesn't necessarily work only one way. Because of the age of these children, we couldn't follow them all up into adulthood, but for 630 of these sons and daughters, we could look at them. We had measures of them for when they were over 22, so they were decent age into adulthood, and we could look at their adult attitudes and behaviours at that point. So we could make that link between their childhood post-transmission and their adult behaviours and attitudes. And what did we find? Well, in order to distinguish the influence of fathers and the influence of mothers, we used a measure of whether both parents had more traditional attitudes. So they tended to agree with the statement about the division of labour, or whether there was the difference between parents. So whether the father was traditional but the mother was not, or whether the mother was more traditional and the father was not. And then we had the three measures of the three behavioural measures. What we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that where both parents had more traditional attitudes, both boys and girls had more traditional attitudes. But over and above that, we found that where the father had traditional attitudes but the mother didn't, boys' attitudes tended to be more traditional, but girls' attitudes were not affected. And this was once you were controlling for other issues that might be relevant, like the age of the child, but also the parental educational level. And similarly, when we found that the mother had more traditional attitudes, but the father didn't, this didn't have any effect on sons' attitudes, but it did mean that daughters had more traditional attitudes. So we find a quite clear pattern of this sort of same-sex dyad influence, that fathers are more influential for what boys think and mothers are more influential for what girls think. In terms of the behaviours we looked at, we found that the time that the mother spent as a housewife during as the children were growing up made both boys and girls more likely to have more traditional attitudes. So it influenced them in a similar way. Interestingly, where housework was more unequal, that is where the mother did more housework, more of the total housework than the father, where that was more the case, boys had more traditional attitudes, but girls were unaffected. I think this is quite interesting because it perhaps shows the ways that what people are seeing, they can interpret in slightly different ways. So on the one hand, girls may see the parents sort of modelling a more traditional division of the housework, but they might also think that's the way they should behave, but they might also see the downsides to that for themselves. Whereas boys might see not only that this is the way to behave, but they might also see the upsides from their own perspective. Interestingly, what we found that over and above this time that the mother spent as a housewife, whether or not the mother was in full-time work at the time the children answered the question about their own attitudes had no effect for either boys or girls. But is this something that just happens in childhood, or are there consequences that carry through into adult attitudes and behaviours? So for this subset where we could measure their attitudes and behaviours at the age of 22 or older, we looked at this question. So we looked at whether the childhood attitudes carried through into adult attitudes or not, and whether they carried through into adult behaviours. So we found that where boys were more traditional, had more traditional childhood attitudes, they also had more traditional adult attitudes. And this was similar for girls, where girls had more traditional attitudes in childhood. This also fed through to more traditional attitudes in adulthood. So we do see that persistence of those attitudes, that socialization seems to matter for adult attitudes. Perhaps most interestingly, we also saw that carry through into behaviours. So we saw that where boys were more traditional in childhood, had more traditional childhood attitudes, they did less housework in adulthood than other young men. And where girls had more traditional attitudes in childhood, they did more housework than those young women who had less traditional attitudes in childhood. And they had differences in their labour market participation as well. So we saw these strong influences on behaviour. So we can see that childhood attitudes matter both for both attitudes and behaviours in adulthood. And we can see the evidence of the importance of the socialisation processes in childhood, the parental socialisation, and the transmission and perpetuation of gendered patterns of behaviour. So just to conclude with some reflections on these findings, we can see that the home is a crucial area for the reproduction of beliefs and behaviours. And we can also see that parents communicate normative beliefs both through what they say or what they think and what they do, the behaviours they model. This means that changes in gender role attitudes on their own will not lead to a more egalitarian society. I've mentioned this in both some stalling in these attitudes, but also the incongruence that people can think one thing and do another. And it's important that these attitudes are congruent with behaviour if we really want to see societal change. I think it's also important to reflect that the mechanisms are stronger for fathers to sons and mothers to daughters. There's a lot of emphasis often in policy discussion and often around change educational policy and trying to think of how patterns of occupational segregation, for example, can be influenced, that focuses primarily on girls and sees issues about changing girls' behaviours and subject choices and so on. I think it's really important to recognise that a change cannot come about just through a focus on girls. We need to also think about boys and fathers. And in conclusion, unless parents match their less traditional words with less traditional actions, what has been called in some of the literature the stalled gender revolution may well stay stuck. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing now.